Last summer, I took a break from 1990s F1 to tell the story of the first ever Drivers' Champion. Anyone remember his name? That's right, it wasn't any of the big names of the era, Achille Varzi or Louis Chiron at Bugatti or Tazio Nuvolari at Alfa Romeo, but Nuvolari's stablemate Ferdinando Minoia, who clocked the most kilometres raced across the three championship 10-hour races at Monza, Montlery and Spa-Francorchamps, though he didn't actually win any of them. So let's continue the story as the AIACR, the Association Internationale des Automobiles Clubs Reconnus, met to decide on the championship races for 1932, expanding the selection to cover the 5 countries most involved in motorsport at the time, the Italian, French, Belgian, German and Spanish Grand Prix, with the Indy 500, already in its 20th year, recognised as a grande épreuve but obviously not included in the European Championship. In addition, points would be awarded for constructors too, something that had been done in the past, though the format was evidently poorly understood, as several contemporary magazines seem to have believed constructors and drivers were all ranked in the same table, which makes no sense at all, but this was new to everyone. The Spanish Grand Prix had been cancelled in 1931, as in April the shaky Spanish government that had been established following the overthrow of dictator Manuel Primo de Rivera collapsed in turn, and a republic was declared, which set about dismantling the remnants of the monarchy, reforming the army, and sweeping away the hold the Catholic Church held over the country. Not everyone, and particularly not within the army, was entirely convinced of this radical programme, and Spain sank deeper into political turmoil, so once again the Spanish Grand Prix slated for September in San Sebastian was cancelled. This was of course the era of the Great Depression following the Wall Street crash of 1929, and several other races were cancelled through lack of funds, most notably the Belgian Grand Prix, whose organisers felt that the 1931 race hadn't lived up to expectations financially and pulled the plug, deciding to run it as a sports car event instead. With the championship now down to 3 races again, it had been intended to promote May's Circuito di Mugello to open the season, only for that race to be postponed indefinitely too. So 3 races it was, though the format was changed such that, rather than mandating a 10-hour race, the organisers were permitted to select a duration between 5 and 10 hours. In the event all 3 chose 5. There was also a change in the rules to permit single-seater cars, which would allow the construction of purebred racing cars rather than them having to be adapted road cars. So, first let's look at the major contenders and then get into the events of the year. Once again, I'm deeply indebted to the insane amounts of work put in by Leif Snellman and Hans Etzroth of the website goldenera.fi and of the sources they used in turn. The 3 major factory teams returned from 1931, Alfa Romeo and Maserati from Italy, and Bugatti from France. In Bologna, the Maserati brothers had built a series of fine cars and been front-runners in 1931. The organisation was struck by tragedy though. Alfieri had had a racing accident in 1927 and lost a kidney, and in March he needed an operation on his remaining one, but died of complications from the surgery at the age of 44. Alfieri's brothers rallied to the cause. The youngest, Ernesto, mostly retired from driving and took over running the factory. Bindo returned from the Isotta Fraschini luxury car firm to become president, and Ettore remained in operations. Luigi Fagioli and René Dreyfus were retained from 1931 on the driving staff, alongside Amedeo Ruggeri, who had contested the Gran Premio di Monza for them the previous year. Alfieri Maserati's last design, the big V5 Bimotore with its supercharged 5-litre V16 engine, 2 V8s mounted side by side, hence Bimotore, was available, as were a number of the smaller M26 8-cylinder 2.5 and 2.8-litre cars. The Bugatti firm at Molsheim in French Alsace also continued with their previous year's designs, which had proved successful. The 2.3-litre Type 51, which had won on its debut at the French Grand Prix in 1931, and the larger 5-litre Type 53. Though decked out in French blue, however, the main hope of the Bugatti factory continued to be Italian Achille Varzi and Monegasque Louis Chiron, with Frenchmen Albert Divot and Guy Bouriat their second-string drivers. But the Alfa Romeo concern, heavily backed by the Italian state, were seen to be the team to beat, and for the 1932 season had a new car. The Tipo A, which debuted in 1931, had been an interim model, and the Tipo B, the first true single-seater racing car. With its supercharged V8, it was very light for the period, and designer Vittorio Jano, who had designed the successful P2 of the 1920s, dubbed it the P3. Driving the car were several of the stars of 1931, including Tazio Nuvolari, who'd turned 40 this year, Baconin Bozzacchini, now often racing under the name Mario Umberto Bozzacchini, being named after a Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, not entirely popular with Mussolini's government, and Giuseppe Campari, and the new recruit was the German with the Italian surname, Rudolf Caracciola, who had impressed at the wheel of his big white 7-litre Mercedes-Benz in 1931. Alfa Romeo also had an on-again, off-again relationship with Enzo Ferrari, who operated something of a second team for them, running older cars. For 1930 that would mean the 8C and 6C models, and would continue taking over the reins of the works team at events the factory didn't want to put a full entry in for. There were privateers too, of course, the most serious of whom were the French duo of Marcel Lehoux and Jean-Pierre Wimy, both driving Bugattis, as did Heinrich Joachim von Morgan, Hermann Prinz zu Leiningen, and Ernst Günther Burggaller, who together made up the Deutsche Bugatti team, and Paul Pietsch, Hans Levy and Hans Simons, who made up the Eifelrennen team, though these two German teams were only expected to contest the domestic races. Another German, Hans Stuck, had spent a profitable European winter racing his Mercedes SSKL in South America, and had intended to enter the championship races, only for the factory in Untertürkheim to pull the plug on their motor racing division. More funding was secured from chemical firm Merck, but only for the 2 non-championship rounds in Germany. On the 1st of March 1932, the infant son of the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh was kidnapped from the family home in New Jersey. The case of the Lindbergh baby immediately became front-page news around the world. A handwritten ransom note in broken English was found with some kind of unknown symbol on the bottom, which just excited more speculation, and as soon as this news was known, hundreds of people descended on the Lindbergh estate, destroying any footprints that may have been left. The superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, Henry Norman Schwarzkopf, father of the Gulf War general, was aided by the FBI despite it not being a federal case. A second ransom note increasing the demands from $50,000 to $70,000 was received a week later, followed by a third. In the Far East, Japan had invaded China in September 1931, and by the March of 1932 occupied most of the northeast of the country, whose fledgling government was attempting to re-establish order after a period of infighting between various warlords, and had both Japan and the Soviet Union attempting to carve off some territory. In March 1932, Japan established a puppet state called Manchukuo, based in the geographical region of Manchuria, north of Korea. The German presidential election was held in mid-March, with incumbent Paul von Hindenburg facing a challenge from Adolf Hitler of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and Ernst Thälmann of the Communist Party. The old General Hindenburg was 84 and had no desire to run again, but was persuaded that he was the only candidate who could rally enough support to stop Hitler, who openly professed a desire to end the Weimar Republic and institute one-party Nazi government. The vote in March saw Hindenburg, supported by a coalition of centrist and liberal parties, get 7 million more votes than Hitler, with Thälmann trailing in third. But, having polled 49.5% of the vote, Hindenburg was not quite over the 50% threshold to be re-elected, and there'd have to be a rerun in April. As the previous year, the first motor race of 1932 was the Swedish Winter Grand Prix, held on the 29th of February, on a frozen course around and across Lake Rēmen. This year won by Ola Benström in his Ford, with the first major race being the 4th Grand Prix de Tunisie, on a street circuit in the Carthage district. Of the major stables, Maserati, still recovering from the death of Alfieri, entered 2 cars for René Dreyfus and Luigi Fagioli. Alfa Romeo delegated their entry to Enzo Ferrari with a single car, driven by Eugenio Siena, while Bugatti were officially absent, though their 2 factory drivers, Achille Varzi and Louis Chiron, were both in attendance with privately entered 2.3-litre T51s. Picking up the numbers, of course, with the privateer entries, among them Philippe Étincelin in a second Alfa Romeo Monza, Jean de Malplan in a Maserati 26M, Marcel Lehoux, Jean-Pierre Wimy, and Heinrich Joachim von Morgan in the big 5-litre Bugatti Type 54s, and everyone else in the smaller Bugatti 51s, plus 9 in the up to 1.5-litre Voiturette class. A hurricane in December had destroyed some of the stands, pits, and most importantly the restaurant, but the Tunisian organisers were keen for the race to go ahead, and so it did. Practice suggested that the newer Bugattis, even without official work support, were the class of the field, though they only drew positions on the 3rd and 4th row, with Wimi, Lehoux and Fagioli taking the front row. Nonetheless, Varzi got the best start from the flag and went into the lead, with Chiron making his way up to finish the first 26-minute lap in second place. Those expecting a duel between the two, though, were disappointed when the Monegasque driver hit ignition trouble and made a long stop of 3 minutes, promoting the Maseratis of Fagioli and Dreyfus, as Chiron slowly made his way back towards the front. After 15 laps, Chiron was up to 8th now, chasing Dreyfus in 7th, who'd had to stop for new spark plugs, while Fagioli was nearly 2 minutes behind a dominant Varzi, and soon he too had mechanical trouble. His supercharger went and he rolled to a stop. In the end, it was an easy win for Achille Varzi, though Marcel Lehoux in the 5-litre Bugatti was gaining on him at the end, with Philippe Étincelant third in one of the private Alphas, and the official one fourth. Chiron had to stop again for more repairs and finished a respectable 6th in the circumstances, while the Voiturette class was won by Louis Joly in a 1.5-litre Maserati 26. Between races, Germany erupted in more political turmoil as the traditional truce forbidding political activities around Easter expired and violent clashes ensued before the election runoff a week later. Hundreds were arrested in violence around the country, but when the votes were counted, and with the 2.5 million votes won by the monarchist Stahlhelm group now redistributed, von Hindenburg was able to make it over the line with 53% of the vote to re-elect him as president for a new 7-year term. However, at the age of 84, and having been unwilling to stand in the first place, it was considered unlikely that he would see out his term. Nonetheless, he got to work immediately, ordering the SA, the SS and other Nazi paramilitary groups to be disbanded. Hitler declared that the date of the upcoming local elections, the 24th of April, would be Retaliation Day, and Germany continued to hold its breath. Meanwhile, it was time for the 4th running of the Monaco Grand Prix, following the popular local win by Louis Chiron the previous year. Inaugural winner William Grover Williams was there in a private Bugatti T51, and Chile's first racing driver Juan Zanelli had an unusual mount, a Nacional Pescara, a Spanish firm which had received state backing but was now facing an uncertain future. But unlike in Tunis, the big guns were out in force in Monaco. Bugatti with 4 works cars for Guy Bouriat and Albert Divot alongside Chiron and Varzi. Divot trying out a 5-litre Type 53 during practice, but racing in the Type 51 like the rest. 3 works-entered Alfa Romeo Monzas for Baccanin Bozzacchini, Giuseppe Campari and Tazio Nuvolari, and Maserati 8Cs for Dreyfus and Fagioli, plus a smaller 26M for Amedeo Ruggieri. By inviting a select group of just 19 entries, as opposed to the come one come all 27 entries the previous year, the Automobile Club de Monaco was hoping to further enhance the race's reputation as an elite event. Thursday saw a novelty, timed practice sessions, though the starting grid was still decided by ballot, with the Alphas of Campari and Bozzacchini quickest on Thursday and Friday respectively, but Chiron top of the timings on Saturday. Nonetheless, it was Grover Williams who would line up at the front on race day, with Étincelant in a private Alfa and Ruggieri in the Maserati on the front row, Chiron immediately behind Williams in 4th, alongside Campari, Varzi on the penultimate row, and Fagioli last of all. Chiron was straight into the lead when the flag dropped and led the way up the hill, chased by Williams and Lehoux, but Nuvolari was coming up quickly from the 4th row and was second by the end of lap 10, while Varzi and Caracciola, driving a private Alfa, were also advancing from the back of the grid. Nuvolari in his Alfa was quick, but not as quick as the local boy, as he just couldn't make an impression on Chiron's lead, while by lap 20 Varzi had made his way up to 3rd and was just 5 seconds behind Tazio. Such was the pace that by lap 36 Chiron was already encountering tail-enders. Going through the station hairpin behind Tchaikovsky's Bugatti, Chiron went into the tunnel behind the Polish Count, but clipped a sandbag as Tchaikovsky fishtailed in the chicane, and spun, then turned over and tumbled, coming to the rest on top of the sandbag barrier perilously close to falling into the harbour, while Chiron, thrown from the car, lay lifeless on the ground. Monaco held its breath as Nuvolari squirreled through the gap, but to the relief of all the locals, Chiron stirred, then rose, dazed, bruised and scraped, and he'd be very sore for a while, but he was lucky that nothing worse had happened. Nuvolari took over the lead, still chased hotly by Varzi, with Bozzacchini and Caracciola now running close together, 3rd and 4th not far behind, but for whatever reason Varzi began to slow and Nuvolari extended his lead as the strain on the cars started to show, with one driver after another stopping for repairs, Étincelant with brakes, Lehoux and Devo both losing oil, then Étincelant pulling out entirely with a dud gearbox, as did Tchaikovsky, leaving just 13 running at half distance, and little prospect of a change in the order until on lap 57, with his brakes starting to fade, Borzacchini lost third to Caracciola, which became second when Varzi pulled in for repairs. The mechanics worked in vain, but he was out, and with him Bugatti's hopes of winning for a second year. Now only 4 cars were on the lead lap: Nuvolari, Caracciola, Borzacchini and Fagioli. Borzacchini had been more or less keeping pace with Caracciola, but had to pit himself, though he was far enough ahead of Fagioli to retain third with a reduced lead. Guy Bouriat made it a very bad weekend for Bugatti as he went wide and into the sandbags at the station hairpin, losing a lot of time as he reversed back out and got going again, then stopped to change his damaged wheel, but he'd already been 2 laps down in 9th place. Fagioli passed Borzacchini for third in the dying stages before the latter pulled in to retire anyway on lap 85, and Nuvolari clocked off the last 5 laps to take the win, though Rudolf Caracciola gave him a bit of a wake-up in the last few laps to finish just 7 seconds behind, with Fagioli third and Count Freddy Zehnder fourth, 3 laps adrift, while Earl Howe in his private Bugatti had quietly and methodically driven his way from the penultimate row of the grid to 5th. As they got out of their cars, Nuvolari walked over to Caracciola and silently shook his hand, recognising a race well run, and off they went for the prize-giving, Alfa Romeo victorious this year. A week after the Monaco Grand Prix was the date of those local elections in Germany, with just 5 of the 19 states electing regional assemblies, but those 5 included Prussia, by far the biggest, Bavaria, the second biggest, and Württemberg, third in area and 4th in population, as well as the small but populous city-state of Hamburg and Little Anhalt. In all but the latter, the National Socialists won a plurality and would form the new state government, with the government of Prussia, which vastly outweighed all of the other states put together, now in Nazi hands. It was difficult to see how von Hindenburg's government could survive. On the same day, regional elections in Austria also saw gains by the local branch of the NSDAP, which remained a small minority but had made significant gains since the last votes just 2 years earlier. That was also the day of the next Grande Épreuve, the Reale Premio Roma, on the Littorio airfield circuit just outside the Italian capital. Coming just 7 days after the Monaco Grand Prix, few of the major manufacturers bothered with the race, subtitled the Decennial Grand Prix, the 10th anniversary of the fascist takeover in Italy, and Il Duce had commissioned special trophies for the top 3 places, which he no doubt intended would all be Italians. The Maserati works team, at least, were game, entering Dreyfus and Ruggieri in the 8C, though Ruggieri's entry was later withdrawn, alongside Luigi Fagioli in the big 16-litre 5-litre V5. While Alfa Romeo had again delegated their entry to Scuderia Ferrari, who entered Piero Taruffi in a 2.3-litre Monza and Gianfranco Comotti in a 1.8-litre 6C in the second power category. Clemente Biondetti had brought along a Frankencar, a Bugatti chassis with a Maserati engine. Achille Varzi was again there as a private entrant, with Louis Chiron taking the week off after his battering at Monaco. It seems like it wasn't only the drivers and manufacturers who were not terribly enthusiastic about the race. Reporting was so sparse that details of the race are fairly sketchy. To the chagrin of Il Duce, the practice times were headed by the 2 French cars, one driven by an Italian, Varzi, and one by a German, von Morgan, whose Bugatti was painted in German white. The 3 power categories were whittled down to a final field in a series of slightly tedious heats and repêchages, but finally 11 cars were assembled before the dignitaries, including Kin Vittorio Emanuele III, Bruno and Vittorio Mussolini, Vincenzo Florio of Targa Florio fame, and Baron Acerbo of Coppa Acerbo fame. Unfortunately, we don't have a reliable grid for this race, but when Baron Acerbo dropped the flag, Varzi took an initial lead before Fagioli in the big 5-litre Maserati overhauled him and ended the first lap in the lead, chased by the Bugattis of Varzi and von Morgan, and Fagioli never really looked back, the powerful car easily dominating as everyone behind him had to scramble for the table scraps. Taruffi passed von Morgan, whose engine hadn't been quite right all day, and Dreyfus had likewise fallen back with engine trouble. Despite giving it all he had, Varzi was losing time hand over fist on the big Maserati, 28 seconds after 20 laps, and then he had to come in to change a tyre, dropping to 4th, then had to pit again to change 2 more tyres. After a frankly rather dull race, Fagioli cruised home to take an untroubled win, 29 seconds in the end, ahead of Piero Taruffi in the Ferrari entered Alfa, with Von Morgan hanging on to spoil Il Duce's party slightly by bringing the white Bugatti home third. Before the next race, the Targa Florio in early May, Al Capone entered the federal prison in Atlanta to begin his 11-year sentence for tax evasion. The initial primaries were taking place in the US for the upcoming 1933 election too, expected to be hotly contended, as incumbent Herbert Hoover was hugely unpopular thanks to his handling of the Great Depression, and elderly French President Paul Doumet was assassinated by a Russian émigré, Paul Gogolov, who was guillotined 4 months later after a swift trial. Doumet, an independent, had only been elected the previous year in something of a surprise win, and a new president would be chosen by the National Assembly, once it had itself been elected. President Doumet having been killed between the 2 rounds of the Assembly election, which saw leftist parties get the most votes but be unable to form a government, with a coalition of centre and centre-right parties taking over and overwhelmingly electing Albert Lebrun. Because of weather damage, last year's Targa Florio had taken place on the gruelling 149-kilometre Grande Madonia version of the circuit on Sicily, but with repairs now complete and Vincenzo Florio having prevailed upon Mussolini to shell out for a new road on Sicily, the shorter Piccolo Madonia circuit could be used, a much more manageable 72 kilometres, which, importantly, would see the cars pass by the paying spectators 8 times. There was some confusion about the entry. Bugatti had indicated they would enter 4 cars for Varzi, Chiron and Divo, as well as Count Alberto Cornelli, but in the event it was just Varzi and Chiron running as independents, alongside a number of other private Bugattis. Alfa Romeo likewise had initially said they would send the full factory team, but it was actually Enzo Ferrari who turned up with Nuvolari, Borzacchini, Antonio Brivio and Pietro Gerzi, along with the usual privateers, so in the end it was only Maserati who had a works team present, at least in name, 2 8C cars for Luigi Fagioli and Amedeo Ruggieri. But despite that, the Maseratis hadn't handled well at Monaco, so the Bugattis and Alfas were favoured for the win. Under blazing skies, with full temporary grandstands, the cars were sent off at 3-minute intervals as usual, beginning with Guido D'Ippolito in his private Alfa. He was accompanied by a mechanic, but others were driving solo. By the end of the first lap, though, last year's winner Nuvolari was in the lead, ahead of Borzacchini and Chiron, with D'Ippolito back in 7th, about 3.5 seconds back. Nuvolari was driving like a demon, as usual, and had extended his lead next time around, while Varzi had dropped out of 4th place with gearbox problems. By the end of the third lap, there were just 8 cars still in the race, and Nuvolari's lead was such that he could spend just under 2 minutes changing his tyres without losing it. During lap 6, Louis Chiron pulled into the pits and climbed out, completely exhausted, still not fully recovered from his Monaco accident, so his teammate Varzi took over to continue the race, still third ahead of Antonio Brivio, who'd broken down and commandeered the car of his teammate Gerzi. After 8 laps, 7.25 hours, Nuvolari swept across the line to thunderous applause, leading home his teammate Borzacchini in a Scuderia Ferrari 1-2, separated by 5.5 minutes, with the Chiron and Varzi shared Bugatti third, another 14 minutes or so in arrears. The Gerzi Brivio shared Alfa made it 3 Scuderia Ferrari cars in the top 4, with Ruggieri's Works Maserati and Silvio Rondina's OM665 making up the numbers. The next race was scheduled for late May in Berlin at the AVUS test track, but Germany continued to suffer political instability as some of the National Socialists elected at the recent elections began to disrupt parliamentary proceedings. 4 were suspended from the Reichstag chamber for 30 days for attacking a journalist in the lobby, and when they refused to leave, the Reichstag president, equivalent of Speaker of the House, Paul Löber, shut down the session. On the same day, Defence Minister Wilhelm Groener resigned at the urging of his subordinate Kurt von Schleicher, who wanted to try and compromise with the Nazis and was unhappy that Groener had been instrumental in outlawing the Nazi paramilitary organisations, the SA and SS, a few weeks earlier. Across the border in Austria, following the small gains by the National Socialists and heavy losses by the Conservative parties in the local elections, the Social Democratic Party moved to dissolve the Nationalrat and hold a new general election, but instead, Chancellor Karl Buresch's Christian Socialist government resigned en masse, and President Wilhelm Miklas asked another Christian Socialist, Engelbert Dollfuss, to form a new government, in coalition with the Landbund, a conservative agrarian party mainly supported by farmers in Styria, Carinthia and Upper Austria. The day before the race in Berlin, Amelia Earhart landed her Lockheed Vega in a field in Northern Ireland. "Have you come far?" asked a farmland. "From America," she replied. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, having already become the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air full stop. The day after that, Mussolini opened the International Convention of Transoceanic Flyers to discuss the prospects for transatlantic commercial aviation, and naturally to ensure Italy was at the forefront of it. But the event was overshadowed both by the grisly discovery of the body of Charles Lindbergh's baby son and the death, as they flew in for the event, of Hungarian flyer György Endres while landing at Littorio Airport in Rome. The 1931 race at the AVUS track, the first for 5 years, had proved a roaring success, and as the fastest race in Europe, the 1932 event attracted more of the top entries as well as bigger crowds. Last year's race had been won by Rudolf Caracciola in a big 5-litre Mercedes SSKL, and for 1932 one of their cars had been equipped with rudimentary streamlined bodywork, knocked together in a couple of weeks at the Vetter Works in Cannstatt, and its designer Baron König Fachsenfeld reckoned it would add another 20 km an hour to the maximum speed. Rather than the traditional German race in white, the SSKL Streamliner was painted silver to match the bare metal sections and would be driven by Manfred von Brauchitsch. Hans Stuck had another SSKL with a streamlined tail section, but none of these were official Mercedes cars because, of course, the Stuttgart firm had decided not to run a works team in 1932. There was an array of Bugattis in various national colours, white with red detailing for local boy Heinrich Joachim von Morgan, white and red for Swiss driver Hans Stuber, red, white and green for Hungarian Laszlo Hartmann, and white and blue for the Czechoslovakian driver Prince Lobkowitz. And the Bugatti factory team were there too, with a 4-man team of Varzi, Chiron, Devo and Buriat. The Maserati team sent Dreyfus and Fagioli, but the Alfa Romeo works team had again decided to give it a miss, though they could hardly keep their driver Rudolf Caracciola away, and he appeared as a private entrant in a red and white painted Alfa Monza. With huge crowds estimated at anything upwards of 150,000, Caracciola and von Morgan were drawn in the front row alongside Devo, with von Brauchitsch in the streamliner behind, and off they went. But tragedy struck early when Prince Lobkowitz, having started at the back but made up a place or two, was crowded against a concrete wall and went off just before the sudden loop, cartwheeling across the grass and throwing the prince onto the railway tracks, from whence he was taken to hospital but died without regaining consciousness. It was nearly much worse, as Hans Levy, the driver who'd crowded him over, then overcorrected, crossed the median and nearly hit Albert Deveau head-on coming the other way, before getting back on the right side of the road, before a front wheel disintegrated anyway and he ended up in a ditch unhurt. Deveau in the big Bugatti was leading by the end of lap 2, chased by teammate Buriat, then Caracciola, with von Brauchitsch fourth after making a pit stop. On lap 3, land speed record holder Malcolm Campbell retired his Sunbeam with a broken oil pipe, and second place Guy Buriat was also having trouble, a broken supercharger seeing him drop down to 8th before retiring, but seemingly nothing could trouble Albert Deveau, as he could afford now to slow the pace, with Caracciola 40 seconds behind him, until on lap 6 Deveau appeared at the pits in a haze of smoke, having also broken an oil pipe, leaving Caracciola in the lead from Brauchitsch and William Grover Williams in his green Bugatti. On lap 8, the streamlined Mercedes caught the leading Alfa, and the pair began a great battle for the lead as cars dropped out as their machinery just couldn't take the pace, leaving just 5 still running by lap 11 out of 15, 4 Germans and 1 Swiss. And next time round, von Brauchitsch overtook Caracciola for the final time, leading the Alfa home by just 4 seconds in a rousing finish, followed by Hans Stuber third, Hans Stuck fourth in his private Mercedes, and Ernst Kotter's Maserati fifth. After his disappointing race, René Dreyfus parted ways with the Maserati works team and was taken on by Bugatti, while investigations concluded that Prince Lobkowitz's accident was just one of those things. The prince's coffin, draped in the flag of the Allgemeines Deutsches Automobilclub, ADAC, returned to the family estate at Horin, north of Prague, for a funeral attended by most of the surviving royalty and nobility of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Dreyfus would make his Bugatti debut a week later at the Eifelrennen race at the Nürburgring, albeit officially as a privateer, with Louis Chiron driving the sole works car. Mercedes cars were entered independently by von Brauchitsch, once again shorn of the streamlining, Hans Stuck and Albert Broschek, while Caracciola in his Alfa and von Morgan in his Bugatti were also there amid a field of 23 cars across 3 categories. the big Italian manufacturers declining to make the trip, with the Italian Grand Prix coming up a week later. Sadly, the second official practice session on Friday saw another death, this time Hans-Joachim von Morgan, who crashed at Hatzenbach. There were no witnesses, and the next drivers on the scene found the Bugatti with its nose in a ditch and its rear on the road, and its occupant hanging out of the cockpit dead of a triple skull fracture. To this day, nobody really knows what happened. Despite this, the political uncertainty and the difficulty of getting to the Nürburgring compared to the outskirts of Berlin, there were still 120,000 packed in to watch as the cars set off in batches by category, ending with the 6 cars of the 15cc plus category. Chiron and Dreyfus went into an early lead, but Chiron developed engine trouble and dropped back, while Caracciola took the lead from Dreyfus before the end, with von Brauchitsch third. But the big Mercedes was far less suited to the twists and turns of the Nordschleife, and the 2 lighter cars were able to pull away. A rain shower on lap 5 didn't affect the order, but did help everyone cool their tyres, and in the end a rather processional race finished after 14 laps, with Caracciola leading Dreyfus home by 22 seconds, followed at some distance by the 2 big Mercs of Brauchitsch and Stuck, then Chiron and Broschek, who had both suffered mechanical trouble. There was more trouble in Germany as the leader of the Prussian communist group, Wilhelm Pieck, disrupted the Prussian parliament by shouting out that there were murderers among the National Socialist deputies, and the session descended into a mass brawl, leaving 8 deputies injured, while the continuing economic depression led to food riots in Hamburg that left 1 policeman and 1 rioter dead. A few days later, the regional parliament of Little Oldenburg, a small state in the northwest of the country, held elections which saw the Nazis gain 24 of the 48 seats, the first time they'd held an absolute majority anywhere. A few days after that, Chancellor Brüning resigned, and President Hindenburg called upon a surprise candidate, the aristocratic Franz von Papen, a bit of a non-entity with little support in the Reichstag, but suggested by his former military comrade Kurt von Schleicher, who then became defence minister, and the effective power behind von Papen. He chose his entire cabinet for him. And that's where we'll leave it for this week. Next time we'll have the entire championship and the rest of 1932. See you then.
Once I built a railroad, made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower to the